We tell ourselves that we're safe. We check the locks, buckle our seatbelts, switch on the alarm to keep the danger out. But death has a way of slipping through the cracks. It waits in rivers, on quiet highways, or even in the shadowy corners of our kitchen or bedrooms. And when it comes calling, there is nothing we can do to stop it. Or is there? Because in the remarkable cases you're about to hear, men, women, and children stare certain death in the face until the paranormal appears to save their very lives. Yes, ghosts are said to terrify, and tonight's stories are indeed frightening, but sometimes ghosts seem to protect us. You're about to hear some astonishing cases where the line between death and survival was decided by those who had already crossed it. I'm Peter Laws, and tonight on Into the Fog, we get saved by a ghost. The first case we'll explore made headlines across the United States, not just because of its tragedy, but because the supernatural seemed to be woven through it. It occurred on Saturday, March 7th, 2015, just south of Salt Lake City in Utah. That morning, a fisherman made a grim discovery. He was walking by the Spanish Fork River when he noticed something shocking. A car was lying upside down in the freezing water. The metal body was crumpled, its windows pressed under the current. It was half submerged in the river, and he groaned as he looked back up at where it must have come from. Above him ran a bridge, and it was clear. This car, a red Dodge sedan, must have veered off the road and plunged from the bridge and into this icy water. And as he stared back at the car, he knew that there was barely any chance that anybody could have survived this. Surely they must have drowned. But still, he grabbed his phone and he called the emergency services. Police officers from the Spanish Forks Police Department, along with paramedics and a tow truck, rushed to the site, sirens blaring. And when they pulled up and got out, they hurried down the embankment towards the ruined car. They had little hope that they would find anyone inside alive, but they had to be sure. And so they waded into the frigid river, bracing themselves against the cold. And as they moved closer to the crumpled car, something extraordinary happened. The officers heard a voice, a woman's voice, and it said,
"Help me. We're in here."
Now, you may think that this was some kind of embellishment or urban myth, or that they misheard the wail of the waters and thought it sounded like a voice, but no, they were sure of it. Officer Tyler Beddoes was there that day, and he spoke frankly to news reporters, saying,
"We could see a person in the front seat, and then we heard a voice saying, 'Help me, we're in here.' It was as clear as day."
Despite the mysterious quality of this floating voice, the sound of it spurred the officers on. If someone was inside, then they couldn't wait a single second more. They all pushed forward and quickly attached metal hooks to the car. Then they gave the signal to haul the wreck from the water. And they watched as the vehicle was dragged from the river, and then on the bankside, they were able to turn the car upright. Torrents of dirty river water poured from its frame as it shook back into an upright position. And then they reached for the door handle and opened it.
Oh my God.
There were two people inside. In the driver's seat was the body of a woman. She was dead, and it was clear how she had died too. It had been nightmarish. Because the car had flipped over and landed in the river upturned, her head had been trapped beneath the flowing current of the river. She had drowned. They would later learn that her name was Jennifer Groesbeck. But it was when they looked into the back seat that they gasped in shock. There was a little girl back there, only 18 months old. This was Jennifer's daughter, Lily. But to their astonishment, Lily was alive. Now, Jennifer's head was lost under the water, so there'd been no hope for her. But because of Lily's tiny size and because she'd been strapped securely into a car seat, the little one had been suspended upside down, meaning she had narrowly avoided her head being submerged by the river. But it was close. Her face was just above the waterline. And this poor child had been like this for a harrowing 14 hours. She was so weak and barely clinging to life, but the rescuers performed CPR on Lily, and then they raced her to the hospital. And against all the odds, Lily recovered. Now, the wider family were of course devastated by the loss of Jennifer, but they were amazed at how Lily had managed to survive being in that upturned car for so long. Lily's grandfather told reporters,
"Her improvement is outstanding. We are blown away by progress."
Well, later the investigators pieced together what had led to this tragedy. Jennifer's parents lived in Salem, so she'd been visiting them, but then she was driving back to her own home in nearby Springville, and Jenny had been heading back to Springville when she went over this bridge at about 10:30 p.m. And it was then that she had lost control of the car. There were no skid marks on the road and no mechanical faults with the car, though it was learned that Jennifer did have drugs in her system. But the truly chilling part came later. It was the timings of the death, you see. The medical examiners confirmed that Jennifer had died the night before the wreck was discovered. In other words, she could not possibly have been the one calling for help. And yet, every rescuer on that day insisted they had heard a woman's voice calling out. And so who or what had said them? Was it Jennifer's spirit urging the rescuers to save her child even from beyond the grave? Or, and this is wild, could it have been some psychic cry projected from the little girl herself? After all, she said, "Help me, we're in here." Who can tell? But the fact is that when the officers arrived on that scene, they assumed the worst, and yet it was the voice that spurred them on to shift that car and check who said it, and if they hadn't moved so fast, perhaps Lily wouldn't have survived. Now, some writers, like those at Snopes, for example, have pointed out that stories of ghostly rescues often follow this pattern of legend or folklore, and it's true. Tales of voices or apparitions guiding people to safety have circulated for centuries. But in this case, we're not talking about a vague urban myth. The Groesbeck incident was covered by major news outlets of the time, and multiple trained first responders independently confirmed that they had heard a female voice calling for help, even though the child's mother was already dead. Officer Beddoes summed it up with a startling clarity.
For 2 nights, I've laid awake trying to figure out exactly what it could be. All I know is it was there. We all heard it. It was extra motivation.
Another paranormal roadside case unfolded in Sacramento, California. It happened on June the 6th, 1994. Christine Skubish was driving her car with her 3-year-old son, Nick, in the back. And yet Christine was exhausted as she drove, and she dozed off at the wheel. Just picture that for a second, and maybe remind yourself of the image the next time you think it's okay to push through extreme tiredness when you drive. Please don't. Because as Christine's eyes dropped shut and she fell asleep, she lost complete control of the steering wheel. And she was the only one on the road, thankfully, so she didn't hit anybody else. But her car still veered off the deserted highway and plummeted 40 feet down an embankment. And since there was nobody on the road during the crash, nobody saw the car go over. And even worse, the car ended up in a position that wasn't visible to other drivers when the road filled up later, which meant that the 3-year-old boy, Nick, who was still alive, was stuck in that car, exposed to the elements and without food or water. And this ordeal went on for 1 day, then another, then another. But then, listen to this. 4 days after the crash, the car with Nick still in it hadn't yet been discovered. But then on June 10th, something very strange happened in a house in Sacramento. There was a woman called Deborah Hoyt. She was sleeping in bed with her husband when suddenly she sat bolt upright awake. Her waking was so dramatic that it disturbed her husband, and he asked her what was wrong. She said she had an overpowering sense that she needed to leave their house immediately. He asked her why. Deborah couldn't explain it. She said she wanted to get in the car, and so they did. And they drove for a while. And it was while they were driving along Highway 50 that they passed something chilling. There was a body lying on the road. A woman. Horrified, the Hoyts called 911, and the police rushed out to the location. But when they searched the area where this woman had been spotted, they couldn't find anything. Now, were the couple mistaken? No, they insisted they had seen a woman's body strewn by the roadside. Well, the police gave up searching for this person and they left the area. And that was when the mystery really deepened. You see, now that Christine Skubish and her 3-year-old son Nick had been missing for days, word of their disappearance reached that very same police department. And hearing suddenly about a missing woman couldn't help but remind them of what the Hoyt couple had just seen. And so, it prompted the deputies to head back out to the same stretch of road where the woman was spotted, just in case they saw something they missed the first time. And they did. El Dorado County Deputy Rich Strasser spotted something in the dirt. It was a child's shoe. Searching further, he was able to locate an embankment, and he headed down the slope. And that's when it came into view. Christine's shattered car, lying at the bottom. Inside, she was dead. But Nick, despite being only 3 years old and after 4 days of hunger, cold, and exhaustion, was alive. Barely, but yes, he was alive. He was rushed to hospital, and to everybody's amazement, he recovered. Deborah Hoyt did not know Christine Skubish. So why on earth did she wake up with a compulsion to get up and drive that morning? And why did they choose that specific stretch of highway? But even more mysterious, who was the woman lying in the dirt? The one who had vanished into thin air? Well, Christine's relatives knew who it was. They just knew it. They were convinced that this woman had been Christine herself. And maybe you might think, like I did, that after the wreck, perhaps Christine had somehow crawled out of the car, up the embankment to get help, which meant the Hoyts saw her, but she then returned back to check on Nick and then had died in the car with him. That would explain at least part of the mystery. Only there's one snag to that. You see, the investigators determined that Christine had been instantly killed when the crash occurred. She'd never left that car. Had she somehow reached from the other side to save the life of her son and drawn in a stranger to help her? So far, we've looked at car wrecks where voices and visions seem to have intervened to save the lives of children. But our next case turns to a different kind of threat: murder. And the protector here was no less spectral. I found this case buried in the New York State Historical Archives, and it's an extraordinary story. On January the 11th, 1908, the Watertown Reunion newspaper ran ads for clothing sales and updates from the Supreme Court, but as I glanced through it, one headline jumped out that I couldn't resist: "Man's life saved by wife's ghost." This article tells of Charles Henry Durand. He was a farmer from New Jersey, and one night he was returning home by wagon when his horse suddenly froze and began trembling violently. Charles looked around and saw nothing that could be causing this fright, but his trusted horse was very clearly terrified of something. And no matter how hard he tried, he could not get this animal to move forward. It was as if something was in front, stopping him. It wasn't just the horse who reacted, because Charles Durand himself soon began to feel the air shift. The atmosphere grew heavy and oppressive, and then the air around him seemed to start like flashing as if there was silent lightning. And out of this odd disturbance on the road in front of them, a pale figure began to emerge. How would you feel if you ran into what appeared to be a ghost on a lonely road at night? Well, I love how the paper puts it. It says that when the figure appeared, Durand himself commenced to quake. He was now shaking with as much fright as his horse was. and his instinct was to get off the wagon and run in the opposite direction. But as he tried to dismount, he found himself rooted by either fear or some other force, because he simply couldn't move. The white figure on the road started to form before him, and then it opened its mouth and spoke.
There is danger at home. Stay away until morning.
And when he heard that voice, he could barely believe his ears. The tone, the intonation, it was unmistakable. That was his wife's voice. His dead wife. As that realization hit, the figure faded quickly and vanished. And he just sat there on that deserted dirt road, desperately trying to get his head around what had just happened. And he knew that it was not only in his mind, because the horse's reaction was so strong. In fact, the horse remained so frightened that it refused to budge for nearly 2 hours. And Durand was forced to just sit there on the wagon and accept a serious delay in his journey time. Remember that detail, it's important for what's to come. It was only when he took the horse's harness off, as daylight broke, that the animal was finally ready to move. Well, Charles Durand resumed his journey and finally reached his farmhouse. He put the horse in the stable and went inside. It had been lonely there since his wife had died. But could he take comfort that that was her on the road? And he wondered about her warning him. It certainly had made him cautious as he approached the Wait a second, he thought. He froze as he reached the home, because from the corner of his eye, he noticed a ground floor window. It was ajar and off the latch. He knew he had closed that before he left. He went to investigate more, and he saw footprints tracked across the porch. Was it an intruder? Had he been burgled last night? He started to walk with extreme caution through each room of his house, expecting to see the place ransacked, but nothing seemed amiss. Until, that is, he reached his own bedroom. He was about to step into that room when something bizarre caught his eye, and it was down on the floor. Stretched between one side of the doorframe to the other was a piece of string, and it was pulled tightly. And it was so low that he could have easily missed it, but he was on such high alert after the warning that he wondered if it had been left there to trip him up, or worse. Taking no chances, he found an umbrella in the house, and keeping as much distance as he could, he hooked the handle of that umbrella around the string, and he gave it a little tug to see what would happen. And when he did, he heard a click, and then an explosive boom rattled his ears, and he was astonished to see a sudden smoking hole appear on the opposite side of the hallway. He crept into the room carefully and saw the pistol carefully attached to his bureau, and the string tied to the trigger that lay across the floor and led to the doorway, where it now lay snapped and loose. And it began to dawn on him, just like the light had dawned this very morning, that if he had returned to the farmhouse when he had planned last night, it would have still been dark, and he would almost certainly have missed this piece of string on the floor. And were it not for the warning from his wife's ghost, he would never have lived to tell the tale. The idea of loved ones protecting family members from beyond the grave has been reported more often than you might think. For example, I found a case in the Reporter newspaper from Pennsylvania. It was dated from September the 11th, 1913. And this story involved a clergyman who would always make a point of visiting the scattered and isolated communities that lived on the windswept and lonely Yorkshire Dales. Well, he was on his way across the moors to one of these isolated groups one evening when the clergyman suddenly became aware of a figure moving beside him in the twilight. And when he turned to see who this person was, he was absolutely dumbfounded. It was his own brother, who had died some time before. The clergyman was so dumbstruck by this, he couldn't speak for a while, and they just walked together. But then, gradually, the figure beside him faded and vanished into the darkness. He made a note of the time and the date of the vision, but the more he thought about it, the less bothered he was. He put it down to some vision, a hallucination, an example of wishful thinking. He did miss his brother very much. But then, some years later, his church work brought him some duties at a prison. And he would go in and visit the inmates, encourage them and listen to their stories and their confessions. And there was one inmate who looked rather awkward around him. And he soon discovered why. This prisoner took the vicar to one side and said he wanted to make his confession. And he said this:
"I were very near once taking your life, sir. It was in that bad year. And as I heard, you went carrying money about in those lonesome dales. I hid behind the big boulders of brown moor. I saw you coming up and waited. But that night, you were not alone."
The clergyman was amazed, because once they worked out the timing of it all, they realized that the prisoner had seen him on the night of that visitation from his brother, meaning this apparition had not been in the vicar's head after all. He must have actually been there, walking by his side across the not-so-lonely moor. I discovered the next case in the Croydon Advertiser, and it's really eerie. After the Second World War, an aircraft carrier called the Unicorn returned from the Philippines to Brisbane, Australia. That ship was docked and the war was over, and so the captain of the Unicorn made a decision. Why not open the ship up to the public? They were sure that the locals would love to come on board and see the vessel that had fought against the Japanese. And sure enough, one day a bunch of children from the local school came on board to visit. Now, there was a man from Croydon, England called Stan Hall, and he had worked on the ship during the war but was still working after it. And he was given the task of escorting these children around the ship. There was a few of them doing this, and they did so in groups of 10. And so that day, Stan took his group of 10 children and he walked around the ship doing the big tour. It was all fine. But he was particularly struck by one of the kids as he went round. It was a little girl. She was dressed in white. She always seemed to pay great attention to what he said about the ship. Well, the plan was to show the kids around the vessel, and then they would gather together on the mess deck for some food and refreshments. Once they finished that, the leaders would double-check all 10 kids were present in their little group, and then they would all join together and they would leave the ship for home. It was when they were gathering up the kids at the end and counting, when Stan encountered something weird. He counted his group, and there were 10 children as expected. But none of the children were the little girl dressed in white. He was confused and looked all over the mess deck, but no one said they had seen that girl. He had, and so he reported her missing. He was worried about her. But the other staff looked at him like he was crazy. They were insistent. They had no idea who he was talking about. It was as if the little girl had not existed at all. Some weeks later, the ship pulled into Sydney Harbour, and the crew were given 10 days' leave. Stan had read about the Blue Mountains of Katoomba, and he was very keen to visit. And so he set off and found himself a hotel with a beautiful view of the mountains and the very deep valley that would often be filled with mist. His plan was to trek down the old Aboriginal steps that had been cut out many years ago. And he found a gate at the top of those steps, but it was closed. Now, he'd come all of this way, so he looked left and right, and he climbed over and headed the long journey down. The more steps he took downwards, the more uneasy he got, because the mist was growing incredibly thick. Now, I checked this detail because, frankly, I have never heard of these mountains in my life. But sure enough, it was confirmed the valley mist in that particular part of the world, in those mountains and in that valley, is a very frequent phenomenon, and sometimes the mist can cause the visibility to drop to only a few feet. And so just try and picture it in your mind. He's trekking down these unevenly cut steps with a flimsy rope to hold on to, and he can barely see a few feet in front of him. And then something else struck him: his legs. His legs began to throb with some kind of pain, and he felt them starting to tremble and shake. He wasn't sure what was going on, but maybe it was the fear of the moment, the worry of his dangerous predicament. And he knew that he did not want to fall on these steps, because one false move and he could tumble down into that mist. Sheer panic began to set in, and his legs almost gave way. He told the newspaper this:
I stood there, feeling sick, more scared than I'd ever been in the war.
But then he saw something else.
Suddenly I saw a figure in white down at the lower steps. It was the little girl in white I had mislaid on the ship. She was beckoning me.
Now, he was scared for sure, but in that moment, he was more scared for the little girl. He said this to the paper:
In a moment, I forgot all fear for myself. It was transferred to the fear for the little girl and the dangerous steps. I forgot all my pain and followed her. She appeared to stay some distance from me. I never got any nearer, and from time to time she disappeared around the mountainside.
Well, he eventually reached the bottom of the steps, where he came to another locked gate at the bottom, and over it he saw a man and a woman walking through the mist. Stan called over to them and said, "Look, have you seen her? The little girl, is she safe?" They shook their heads and didn't know what on earth he was talking about. Besides, they said, there couldn't have been a little girl on the steps because these steps are completely off limits, and indeed, he certainly shouldn't have been walking down them because it was seriously dangerous. And they asked him, "Why did you ignore the sign at the top? It clearly says, 'Keep out.'" He said there was no sign. They apologized at this and said they would report the missing sign immediately. And they told him, "You don't know how lucky you've been to have made it down through that mist. It had been so thick that day that he could easily have gotten lost and fallen to his death." Well, he climbed over the gate and they took him to the little train that took visitors back up the mountain. And when he got back into his hotel room, he lay there thinking about the experience, and he was so shaken by it that he never told anybody about the little girl. And it was only decades later, in 1990, that he finally started to open up about his bizarre experience. He told the newspaper,
I am as sure now as I was then. The mysterious little girl in white had saved my life.
In a recent interview, actress Kat Dennings, best known for Shifting Gears, WandaVision and Two Broke Girls, shared a chilling memory from her childhood home in Pennsylvania. Dennings explained that her family home dated back to the 17th century and sat in the middle of a forest. The place already had a reputation with the family for being haunted. Strange things happened there. For example, Dennings would listen to music in her room and then compact discs would start to fly off the shelves. Lights would flicker without reason. But she was never particularly scared of these presences because she felt, despite the poltergeist activity, that whatever ghosts were causing it were nice, she said. But then one moment went beyond the playful or the inconvenient. You see, her mother was descending into the basement. This was a place where Dennings described as very creepy in its own right. But at the top of the stairs, her mum tripped. You know, the kind of slip where gravity takes over and there is no stopping the fall? She should have gone crashing headlong down the basement steps, and it would have been a horrific, potentially life-changing accident. Yet something happened that defies explanation. Dennings openly told this in front of an audience to her talk show host, Jennifer Hudson, and she said this: she was stopped, her mum, she was stopped in mid-air and put back to standing. I know, it sounds insane, but she said her mother's body, already past the point of no return, was caught, suspended, and gently placed back on her feet. The only injury she suffered was her little finger as it dragged against the wall. Dennings insists this was no exaggeration and describes this as a serious moment for the family. And she told Hudson,
I swear to God, this happened.
Well, our final two cases are particularly scary and disturbing. Paranormal researcher and writer Brad Steiger spent decades collecting first-hand reports of strange phenomena. One of those reports reached him in 1992, and it's so creepy. He discovered it after he delivered a seminar in San Diego. After his talk, he was packing up his notes and he was chatting with his wife, she was called Sherry, when a woman approached them both. "May I speak with you?" she said. Steiger names her as Margaret G. And what Margaret told them that morning was equal parts terrifying and awe-inspiring. One night, Margaret had been resting at home in her recliner, with a newspaper strewn across her lap. She was fighting exhaustion and drifting in and out of sleep, when suddenly a noise roused her. She followed that noise and realized it was coming from her 3-year-old daughter's room. It was Sissy, her kid, whimpering softly in her sleep. And as she sat listening to her daughter, at that exact moment, another sound broke through the house. Only this one was different. This one came from outside, from the alleyway behind the house. It was the trash can. It had just been knocked over. Her heart quickened. Someone was outside. Margaret knew that to check the alleyway, she would need to look through the kitchen window, and so she very carefully crept towards that room, being sure not to turn the kitchen light on. And as she grew closer to the window, she peeked out. And her breath caught. There was a man, a stranger, and he was standing right in front of the garage. And he was clearly watching their house. Fear bloomed inside her, and she tiptoed quickly back into the living room, and with a trembling hand, she picked up the telephone. Carefully and as quietly as she could, she dialed 911. She winced at how loud the dispatch officer's voice was on the line, but she was still able to whisper her predicament and her address.
911, what's your emergency?
And the voice on the line assured her that an officer was on the way. Now, she waited where she was, and she chose not to go into Sissy's bedroom. I think it's because she was worried that she might alert this man to her presence if she did that. And with her mind racing, she just sat there praying that the approaching squad car would send the prowler running. After all, he was outside and at least hadn't got inside yet. But then, another whimper came from Sissy's room. And as it did, a horrifying revelation hit her like a train. Up until now, she'd assumed the man outside was alone. But what if he wasn't? What if he was watching her place as a lookout for somebody else who might be in her daughter's bedroom right now? The time for caution and quiet had gone, and she flung herself up from her chair and bolted for Sissy's bedroom. And she grabbed a handle and she flung that door open, and what she saw in that room made her heart plummet with terror. Because there was indeed a second man, and right now that man was leaning over Sissy's bed right by her head, and he was wearing a hooded sweatshirt so she couldn't see his face. And she was about to scream at him to get away from my daughter when she suddenly heard something coming from the shadowy darkness of his raised hood. The stranger. He was singing. And as she heard that gentle voice drifting towards her, she recognized the tune. It was familiar to her. It was this 1960s song that her late husband had adored. And all she could think was, why is this stranger singing that particular song to Sissy? Margaret stammered,
Who are you?
but the figure gave no answer, just kept on singing. And so she asked him again,
Who are you?
And this time he lifted his head. And as the dim light of the room fell across his face, she fell backwards against the wall in total shock. It was Will. It was William. That moment, a hammering sound rattled through the house. It was the front door. She realized it was the police shouting out they had finally arrived. But what about this man? And Margaret's eyes darted back towards the bed, and she gasped. Her daughter was asleep, alone. The figure had gone. Trembling, she rushed to the front door and let the officer inside, and they confirmed that they had just apprehended the man outside. And what's more, they knew this guy. He was a convicted repeat burglar with a disturbing record of home invasions. And the conversation that followed between them was chilling.
The man outside your house tonight is a bad guy. Most burglars, they sneak into homes and steal things, slipping away without being seen, but this man is different altogether. He's a sadist. And if he'd thought that there was a woman alone in this house, he wouldn't have only taken things from here. He would have hurt you. And judging by his record, he'd have no problem hurting any kids you had in the house, too.
My God.
Yeah, it's scary. I'm afraid the man had gotten right up to your house. He'd been peeping through the windows, ma'am. So it's great to know your husband was home tonight.
Wait, what did you say?
Seeing your husband put this guy off.
My husband? My William?
Yes. He said he saw you sitting in the chair, and then he saw this big man standing next to you. Then he tried to get into the child's bedroom, but he saw your husband had moved in there and was singing to her.
The burglar saw my husband too?
Yes, ma'am. And just as well he did.
Officer, did he say what my husband was wearing by any chance?
Matter of fact, he did. He said he was dressed in a hooded sweatshirt, like he'd just come back
from running.
That's right. Thank God he was in the house. Hey, where is he now? Doesn't he want to talk to us about what happened? Did he go to bed?
Officer, my husband, William, is dead.
Wait, what?
He died nearly 2 years ago.
What happened?
He was jogging on the beach with some friends, but they decided to make the run harder by jumping over stuff, like hurdles, you know? They saw rocks jutting out of the water, so they started leaping over them. Only the waves made it hard to plant their feet, and William, he slipped and fell just as a wave came in, and it sucked him out. His friends couldn't save him. He tried to swim back, but his heavy sweatshirt was soaked with seawater.
Oh.
It was too heavy. He drowned. His body washed up on the shore the next morning.
I'm so sorry, ma'am. Then I guess the man the burglar saw was someone else?
Well, that's just it. It was William. I saw him with my own eyes, clear as day. He somehow came back to protect us tonight.
And that was the experience that Margaret G. had told Brad Steiger and his wife at the conference in San Diego. And Steiger said that she was clear about it all. She had no doubts whatsoever. She also didn't care if he believed it or not, because she knew for certain that despite the impossibility of it all, William had returned that night just when they needed him most. And she said that she would never forget that brief but wonderful glimpse of his face and the beautiful sound of him singing his song over Sissy as she slept. She was also keen to tell Steiger and his wife that her beloved husband had brought much, much more than just protection that night. He'd given them both a precious gift. A gift that meant everything to a single mother still reeling with grief over her husband's loss. He'd given her proof that death is not the end, that we go on. Now, before I share this final case, just a word of caution. This account involves a home invasion that centers on a sexual predator. And if that's something you'd rather avoid, no shame in that, consider this a heads up before we continue. I've marked this as a chapter on YouTube, so it'll be easy for you to skip ahead if you'd like to. Our final account dates back to 1970. Brad Steiger heard it from a woman named Dorothy. Dorothy was newly married to David, and the couple had moved into a rundown district of Kansas City. Money was tight, and though the area was rough and deprived, they promised each other that it was only temporary. After all, David may have worked at a local factory, but he was also studying business at night school. And the dream was that together they would build a business and would break out of this neighborhood one day. Well, to help make ends meet in those early days, Dorothy worked as a waitress. And David always insisted that she got home from work before it got dark. Was he being overprotective? Well, not really. You see, they had seen a news report about a serial rapist. This man had been attacking women in Kansas City, and if that wasn't bad enough, he was also using a knife in his attacks, and he would deliberately cut and wound his victims. He'd done that to around 6 women in the area, and he had even murdered one of them. And the place where he primarily was finding his targets was the very neighborhood they had just moved into. And so, Dorothy carried on waitressing and coming home before dark, while David worked at the factory and night school. And they just prayed that nothing bad would happen while they waited to escape this house. And nothing bad did happen. But then, October came. One night, Dorothy was sitting barefoot in the living room of her house. She was resting after a long day waitressing. She checked the time. It was nearly 9 o'clock. And so she decided to check on the dinner in the oven. You see, because of the night classes, David tended not to eat his evening meal until about 10:30 p.m. And so she moved towards the kitchen to check it hadn't dried out, when something crazy happened. She was going towards the kitchen door when it was like, well, it was like she had slammed into something invisible, as if a wall of air had blocked her. But not only that, she suddenly felt hands that she couldn't see, grasping her arms and pulling her back from the kitchen door. What was this? Was she losing her mind? Well, determined, she walked back towards the kitchen again. But again, the force and the hands pushed her back. Only this time, she was shoved so hard that she just skittered along the floor and dropped, crashing to her knees. Now, Dorothy was a confident 22-year-old at the time, and she also worked on a farm growing up. She was strong, she was athletic, she was really tall. But as she tried to push herself back up to her feet, she was shocked when she was unable to get up. Some force was keeping her down. But then she grew distracted by something else. Something was starting to flicker in the kitchen doorway. It was a blue light. What on earth was that? She couldn't get up, and so she just had to sit there on the living room floor staring as this blue light started to grow, and then gradually, she said, it began to take shape. It looked, for a moment, just for a moment, it looked as if it was almost forming into the shape of a man. But as soon as she thought she'd seen such an outline, the figure faded from view. She told Steiger that when she saw this apparition, she was, quote, awestruck, especially when she started to see what looked like a hand, an upraised palm floating in the doorway. When she leapt with fright, because the air suddenly broke with the sound of the phone ringing. Now she was able to reach it from where she was sat. She picked it up, and it was Pearl, her next-door neighbor. And what Pearl said was utterly confusing.
Don't speak, just listen to me. These houses are all built in exactly the same style, so I know where your telephone is. So I know you must be near the sofa. So listen to me. You have to sit there and talk to me, and whatever you do not move away from that sofa. Do you hear me? Do not move.
Now, Dorothy was understandably baffled by this, but she did what Pearl asked. But it was what Pearl said next that was truly terrifying.
Listen, don't be scared, all right? But, honey, I'm looking across at your house right now. Listen to me, Dorothy. There's a man standing in your kitchen. I can see him clearly through the window. He's holding a butcher knife, but he's waiting by the kitchen door. I think he's waiting for you to go in.
Well, Pearl said that she had already called the police when she had seen the stranger through the window, which was a relief. And sure enough, the sirens began to fill the street outside very soon after. But all the while, Dorothy was frozen solid, staring at that open doorway, wondering if the man in there might step out into the living room at any second. But then the front door started pounding, and at that precise same moment, she heard the back door open, and then she heard a loud commotion erupting outside the back of her kitchen. Dorothy hadn't appreciated how much time had passed, but she soon did when her husband came rushing into the house through the front door. He'd come back from work and was horrified to have seen his house swarming with police. And he rushed in and found Dorothy, and he threw his arms around her and he held her close, saying, "What's happening? What's happening?" Well, it was the Kansas City police officer who was able to explain it to them both. He came to the shaken couple, sat them down. She was able to move now. And he told them it straight. The man they had just arrested at this house was indeed the serial sex killer who had thrown this neighborhood into fear. Dorothy was confused. So why was he hiding in her kitchen? Why didn't he attempt to come out to get her? Inside, perhaps she wondered if he too had been kept back by the strange force. She soon learned that this was not the case. You see, the officer said that the intruder was a very small man, slight in frame and thin, spindly, weak. It appeared that this man had seen Dorothy and wanted her. Maybe he'd followed her home from work, they didn't know. But he'd managed to get into her kitchen. And he'd been watching her from the kitchen as she sat in the living room. But he had been intimidated by her height, he'd said. And he was scared that if he was to rush in on her in that living room, she would see him too early, and then she might get up and overpower him. Instead, his sick little plan was to wait in the darkness of the kitchen, clutching his knife, and as soon as she walked in, he could step from the shadows and attack her from behind. It wouldn't take him long to incapacitate her with that knife. The officer said that she may well have saved her life that night by never walking into the kitchen. Well, the officers took statements and eventually left. And David was filled with relief and thanks that she hadn't left the room that night, which is when Dorothy told him why. She tried to get into the kitchen several times, yet she was stopped by what she could only describe as a supernatural presence. David listened to this in amazement, and he was convinced. Dorothy must have had a guardian angel, and clearly it had stepped into the gap tonight to protect her. Dorothy wasn't convinced by this theory that it was an angel. She'd seen it, you see. And she had the distinct impression that what had stood in the doorway was not an angel, but a ghost. But who could it have been? And besides, even if the entire presence had been a figment of her imagination, why did this hallucination come at the precise time she needed it? Yet because it came, and she knew it really had, she had been saved from a horrendous ordeal, and possibly may have even saved her life. You know, most average people on the street, if you were to ask them, they would say they have no desire to meet a ghost, not on a lonely highway or a dirt track, or in their kitchen, or especially their child's bedroom. And yet, the cases tonight hint at those rare moments when an apparition might be exactly what we need. So often on this channel, we see people encountering the paranormal, and it is terrifying. Yet perhaps there are times when the dead return not to frighten us, but to protect us. But for now, it is over to you. Do you believe the dead can truly step back into our world to help the living? Reply in the comments with the keywords "fog says yes," or "fog says no," or "fog is uncertain," and we'll tally your answers to see what this community believes. And remember, this is a place for both believers and skeptics and everyone in between, so please be respectful and share your opinions below. But also, if you have ever felt protected or comforted even by someone who has already passed, I wonder if you might be willing to share your experience in the comments. Not only will it be of interest, it may actually bring a great deal of comfort for those out there who could be struggling with grief. But for now, I wish you peace and safety. And if danger or threat should ever creep close to you in the shadows, I pray that you will never face it alone. And think on this too. Have you ever worried about who will protect your loved ones after you're gone? Perhaps the answer is still you. I'm Peter Laws, and you've been watching Into the Fog. Good night.